At 3:47 a.m. on a cold Nova Scotia morning, two children vanished without a trace. But the real tragedy wasn't their disappearance, it was what happened next. Picture this. You wake up to discover your children are gone. Not in their beds, not anywhere in the house. You call the police, desperate, terrified, expecting them to mobilize every resource, follow every protocol, treat this as the emergency it is. Instead, they make one critical decision, a single, seemingly small choice that destroys any real chance of finding your children alive. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover they failed you at the moment you needed them most? Have you ever wondered what happens when the very people sworn to protect us make mistakes so fundamental that they change everything? Do you know a family who's been let down by the system designed to help them? Today we're diving deep into a case that will make you question everything you thought you knew about missing persons investigations. This is the story of Jack and Lilly Sullivan, two innocent children whose disappearance exposed a fatal flaw in RCMP procedures that didn't just compromise their case. It revealed systemic failures that could affect any family, anywhere. But here's what makes this story different from every other true crime case you've heard. The real villain isn't who you think it is. It's not a mysterious stranger, or even someone close to the family. The real villain is a system that failed when it mattered most, and the one decision that changed everything for the Sullivan family forever. If you've ever wondered how a single moment of poor judgment can alter the course of justice, if you've ever questioned whether you can trust the authorities to protect your loved ones, then you need to hear this story. Because what happened to Jack and Lilly Sullivan could happen to any child, in any community, at any time. Before we dive in, hit that like button if you believe families deserve better from the institutions meant to protect them. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because stories like this need to be told. And your engagement helps ensure they reach the people who need to hear them most. Lansdowne Station, Nova Scotia. Population barely 300, the kind of place where neighbors know each other's names, where children play outside until dark, where tragedy feels impossible, rolling hills, modest homes, and the kind of tight-knit community where everyone looks out for everyone else's kids. In this peaceful rural setting lived the Sullivan family. Jack, just 4 years old, with curious eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. His sister Lilly, 6, whose laughter could fill a room and whose precocious questions often surprised the adults around her. Two children living ordinary lives, attending local schools, part of the fabric of their small community. Their mother, Malaya Brooks Murray, was known throughout the area as a devoted parent who, despite facing financial hardships and personal challenges, never stopped fighting for her children. Their stepfather, Daniel Martell, had worked hard to build a stable family unit, even volunteering for polygraph tests when questions arose about his role in their lives. This was a family that, like so many others, was doing their best with the hand they'd been dealt. They weren't perfect, no family is, but they were real people with real love, real struggles, and real hope for their children's futures. But perfection isn't required to deserve justice. Being flawed doesn't mean you deserve to be failed by the system, and what happened to this family reveals a truth that will shake you. When institutions make mistakes, it's always the most vulnerable who pay the price. On that cold morning when Jack and Lilly vanished, their family expected the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to respond with the full weight of their training, experience, and resources. They expected the investigation to follow established protocols designed to maximize the chances of finding missing children alive. They expected competence. They expected urgency. They expected their children's lives to matter. Instead, they got a decision that would haunt this case forever. A choice that flies in the face of everything we know about missing persons investigations, that ignored decades of research about how to find lost children, that prioritized convenience over lives. Here's what I want you to think about as we go through this story together. Every procedure in law enforcement exists for a reason. Every protocol was written in someone else's blood, learned from someone else's tragedy. When authorities deviate from these proven methods, they're not just taking shortcuts, they're gambling with human lives. The Sullivan case isn't just about two missing children. It's about what happens when the people we trust most fail us completely. It's about how a single bad decision can cascade into systemic failure. It's about why expertise matters, why procedures exist, and why we must hold our institutions accountable when they fall short. Over the next hour, we'll uncover exactly what went wrong in those crucial first hours. We'll reveal the fatal flaw that compromised everything that followed. We'll examine how this mistake created a domino effect that destroyed any real chance of finding Jack and Lilly alive. And we'll explore what this case teaches us about protecting our own families in a world where even the experts can fail. But most importantly, we'll honor the memory of two children whose story deserves to be told with the truth, respect, and urgency it never received from the investigation that was supposed to save them. Because Jack and Lilly Sullivan weren't just statistics, they weren't just another case file. They were real children with real dreams, real personalities, real futures that were stolen from them. Not just by whoever took them, but by a system that failed them when they needed it most. Are you ready to learn the truth? Are you prepared to confront the uncomfortable reality that the people we trust to protect us can make mistakes that cost lives? Can you handle the anger you're going to feel when you discover just how preventable this tragedy really was? Then, let's begin with the family at the center of this heartbreaking story. Because understanding who Jack and Lilly were, and who their parents are, is crucial to understanding why what happened to them matters so much. Before we dive into the investigation's failures, you need to understand who we're talking about. Because this isn't just a story about institutional incompetence, it's about real people whose lives were shattered by that incompetence. Jack and Lilly Sullivan weren't newspaper headlines. They were children with favorite toys, bedtime rituals, and dreams for their futures. They were kids who got excited about snow days and asked endless questions about everything they saw. They mattered to their family, their community, and they should have mattered to the investigation tasked with finding them. Jack Sullivan, at just 4 years old, possessed the kind of quiet curiosity that makes childhood magical. His teachers at the local daycare noticed how he would sit slightly apart from the group during story time, not from shyness, but because he was completely absorbed in whatever was being shared. While other children might fidget or whisper, Jack listened with an intensity that seemed unusual for his age. His mother Malaya often spoke about his fascination with how things worked. He'd spend hours watching her prepare meals, asking why she added each ingredient, what would happen if she didn't, where the food came from before they bought it. These weren't just random questions from a bored child. They were the inquiries of a young mind genuinely trying to understand the world around him. One neighbor recalled finding Jack in their backyard one morning, crouched down studying something in the grass. When asked what he was doing, he explained with complete seriousness that he was watching the ants work, because he wanted to know if they talked to each other like people did. That was Jack, a child who saw wonder in the ordinary, who approached life with a scientist's curiosity wrapped in a 4-year-old's innocence. Lilly, 2 years older, was Jack's opposite, in many ways, but his perfect complement. Where Jack observed quietly, Lilly engaged boldly. Her first-grade teacher described her as the kind of student who made teaching a joy, not because she was always well-behaved, but because her enthusiasm was infectious. Lilly asked questions that sometimes stumped adults. During a lesson about different types of families, she raised her hand and asked, "If some kids live with grandparents and some live with one parent, and some live with 2 parents, why do some people think only one way is right?" The teacher later admitted she spent her lunch break researching how to answer that question properly. But Lilly's brightness wasn't just academic. She had an intuitive understanding of emotions that seemed beyond her years. When her younger brother felt overwhelmed or scared, she had a way of sitting beside him and just being present until he felt better. She never tried to fix his feelings or tell him he was wrong to have them. She just stayed close until the storm passed. During community gatherings, Lilly was often found in the center of groups of children, not because she demanded attention, but because she had a gift for including everyone. She noticed the quiet kids and drew them into games. She shared her snacks without being asked. She treated everyone as if they were already her friend. Malaya Brooks Murray loved her children with the fierce protective intensity that only a mother who has faced real hardship can understand. She wasn't perfect, she'd be the first to tell you that, but her imperfections didn't diminish her dedication to Jack and Lilly. Those who knew Malaya described a woman who could stretch a dollar further than seemed possible, who could make Halloween costumes out of things found around the house that looked better than store-bought ones, who read bedtime stories with different voices for every character, even when she was exhausted from working multiple jobs. The financial struggles were real. The judgment from others was constant. The involvement of child welfare services added layers of stress and scrutiny that most parents never face. But through it all, Malaya maintained rituals that made her children feel loved and secure. Every night, regardless of what had happened during the day, she would sit on the edge of each child's bed and ask them to tell her the best part of their day, and one thing they were looking forward to tomorrow. It wasn't therapy or a parenting technique she'd read about. It was just her way of ensuring that each day ended with hope and connection. Daniel Martel stepped into this family dynamic as a stepfather trying to build something stable from circumstances that were already complicated. His role in Jack and Lily's lives wasn't simple to define or easy to navigate, but those who knew him described a man genuinely committed to being part of the solution rather than adding to the problems. When questions arose about his involvement in the children's lives, Daniel didn't just cooperate with authorities. He volunteered for additional scrutiny. He took polygraph tests. He submitted to interviews. He provided alibis and references, not because he was legally required to, but because he understood that suspicion was natural and he wanted to eliminate himself as quickly as possible so the investigation could focus on finding the children. The community's reaction to Daniel was mixed, as it often is when tragedy strikes and people need someone to blame. Some appreciated his transparency and cooperation. Others remained suspicious despite his efforts to clear his name. This division created additional stress for a family already dealing with unimaginable loss. Before the disappearance, the Sullivan household had settled into routines that worked for them. Mornings were chaotic in the way all families with young children know. Finding shoes, packing lunches, negotiations about clothing choices. But there was love in that chaos, purpose in those routines. Lily helped Jack with his jacket and made sure he had his favorite small toy for daycare. Jack waited patiently while Lily brushed her teeth, even though he could have gone first. They had their own ways of looking out for each other that spoke to the security they felt in their family unit. Evenings were calmer. After dinner there was often time for playing in the yard if weather permitted, or indoor games if it didn't. The children would take turns choosing activities, learning early lessons about fairness and compromise. Bath time was accompanied by lots of laughter and splashing. Bedtime stories were a sacred ritual that no amount of tiredness could eliminate. These weren't extraordinary moments. They were the ordinary, precious routines that make childhood feel safe and predictable. They were the memories that would become infinitely more valuable after they could no longer be made. The Sullivan family didn't exist in isolation. They were part of a web of relationships that characterizes small rural communities. Neighbors who checked on each other, local businesses where everyone knew your name, schools where teachers taught multiple generations of the same families. When Jack and Lily disappeared, this network activated immediately. Neighbors joined search parties. Local businesses posted flyers. Churches held vigils. The community responded with the kind of collective action that happens when tragedy strikes close to home. But this same interconnectedness that provided support also created challenges. In small communities, everyone has opinions about everyone else's business. The family's previous involvement with child welfare services was known and discussed. Daniel's role as stepfather was analyzed and debated. Every aspect of their lives became subject to public scrutiny in ways that urban families might never experience. Here's a truth that makes this story even more heartbreaking. The Sullivan family was judged not just for what happened to their children, but for who they were before tragedy struck. Their financial struggles, their past interactions with social services, their family structure, all of it became ammunition for those looking to assign blame. This judgment wasn't fair, but it was human. When children disappear, we desperately want to believe it could never happen to us. So we look for differences, for mistakes the family made that we would never make, for signs that somehow they deserved what happened or failed to prevent it. But here's what I want you to think about. Have you ever made a parenting decision that others criticized? Have you ever struggled financially while trying to provide for your family? Have you ever felt judged for circumstances beyond your control? Then you understand something about what the Sullivan family faced, even before their worst nightmare began. The truth is, what happened to Jack and Lily could happen to any family. The investigative failures that followed could affect any community. The systemic problems we're about to uncover don't discriminate based on income, family structure, or past mistakes. This is our first crucial lesson. Every family deserves competent investigation when tragedy strikes, regardless of their perceived worthiness. Justice isn't something you earn through perfect behavior or ideal circumstances. It's something you deserve simply by being human. The Sullivan family's imperfections don't make them less deserving of answers. Their struggles don't make their children's lives less valuable. Their past mistakes don't justify the failures that followed. Understanding this family, their love, their challenges, their humanity, is essential to understanding why what happened next was so devastating. Because when institutions fail, they don't just compromise investigations. They destroy real people whose only crime was trusting the system to work when they needed it most. Every tragedy has a prehistory, a series of events and pressures that create the conditions for disaster. For the Sullivan family, the months leading up to Jack and Lily's disappearance were marked by increasing scrutiny, mounting stress, and a perfect storm of circumstances that would later complicate the investigation in ways no one could have anticipated. Understanding this context isn't about assigning blame, it's about recognizing how vulnerable families can become trapped in systems that claim to help, but often create additional burdens. It's about seeing how good intentions can have devastating unintended consequences. It started, as many family crises do, with someone trying to help. Teachers at the local school noticed that both Jack and Lily seemed to be developing differently than their peers, not dramatically, not in ways that suggested abuse or neglect, but in subtle patterns that experienced educators recognized as potentially significant. Lily, despite her social brightness, struggled with certain learning concepts that came easily to other children her age. Her reading was behind grade level, and she showed signs of difficulty with sequential processing that might indicate underlying learning challenges. Jack, though younger, displayed some behaviors that suggested possible developmental delays. Nothing severe, but enough to warrant attention. The teachers' concerns came from a place of genuine care. They had seen how early intervention could transform outcomes for children facing learning challenges. They knew that identifying issues early often meant the difference between a child thriving in school versus struggling for years. So they did what they were trained to do. They expressed their concerns to the appropriate authorities. What they couldn't have known is how this well-intentioned report would set in motion a chain of events that would add layers of stress and scrutiny to an already fragile family situation. When Nova Scotia's Child Protection Agency received the report about potential developmental delays, they were required to investigate. This wasn't optional. Once a report is filed, the system demands response. The investigation would determine whether the children needed additional support and whether their home environment was meeting their developmental needs. For most families, this process might be stressful, but manageable. For the Sullivan family, already struggling with financial pressures and community judgment, it felt like an invasion. Social workers began making regular visits. Malaya found herself having to justify parenting decisions she'd made naturally. Daniel's role in the household came under additional scrutiny. The irony is painful to consider. The investigation designed to help the children may have contributed to the very stress and instability that would later complicate efforts to find them when they disappeared. The social workers weren't malicious. They were following protocols designed to protect children. They conducted interviews, observed family interactions, and assessed the home environment according to established criteria. Their final report concluded that while the children would benefit from additional educational support, there was no immediate danger in their home situation. But damage had been done to the family's sense of security and privacy. Every aspect of their lives had been examined and evaluated by strangers. Their parenting had been questioned. Their worthiness as caregivers had been assessed and thankfully confirmed. But the process left scars. This is where we encounter one of the most complex aspects of the Sullivan case: how systems designed to protect children can inadvertently harm families while providing necessary services. The child welfare investigation brought resources, access to specialists, educational support programs, and professional guidance. But it also brought stigma, stress, and the kind of scrutiny that makes normal family life feel impossible. Malaya later described the period as feeling like she was living under a microscope. Every decision was second-guessed. Every challenge was viewed as potential evidence of inadequate parenting. The natural ups and downs of family life, became data points in an official file. For Daniel, the scrutiny was even more intense. As a stepfather in a household with children facing developmental concerns, he faced suspicion that felt both unfair and inescapable. His efforts to be supportive were viewed as potentially controlling. His attempts to maintain boundaries were seen as possibly disengaged. He couldn't win. The children themselves weren't immune to the effects. Lilly, perceptive as she was, understood that adults were asking lots of questions about their family. She began to worry that she or Jack had done something wrong. The security that children need to develop properly was compromised by the very process meant to ensure their well-being. In a small community like Lansdowne Station, official investigations don't remain confidential for long. Word spreads. Neighbors notice social workers' cars in driveways. People talk. And once talk begins, it takes on a life of its own. Some community members were supportive, understanding that all families face challenges and that seeking help should be encouraged rather than stigmatized. They offered practical assistance and emotional support to Malaya and Daniel during a difficult time, but others responded differently. The involvement of child welfare services became proof, in some minds, that there had always been something wrong with the Sullivan family. Previous judgments about their lifestyle, their finances, their family structure seemed validated by official intervention. This community division created additional isolation for the family. Social invitations decreased. Casual conversations became awkward. The support network that small communities usually provide began to fracture under the weight of judgment and speculation. For Malaya, the months of scrutiny created a psychological pressure cooker. As the primary caregiver, she felt responsible for every aspect of her children's development and well-being. The suggestion that she might not be meeting their needs, even if that wasn't the intention of the investigation, struck at the core of her identity as a mother. She began second-guessing decisions that had come naturally before. Should she be reading to them more? Were their developmental delays her fault? Was she failing them in ways she couldn't see? The confidence that effective parenting requires was being systematically undermined by well-meaning professionals who didn't understand the full impact of their involvement. Sleep became elusive. Malaya would lie awake at night, replaying interactions with social workers, wondering if she'd said the wrong thing, worrying about what the next visit might reveal. The stress began affecting her physical health, her emotional stability, and ultimately her ability to provide the consistent, calm presence her children needed. Daniel faced his own unique challenges during this period. As a stepfather, his role in the family was already complex and often misunderstood. The child welfare investigation magnified these complexities, subjecting his every interaction with Jack and Lilly to professional scrutiny. He wanted to be supportive, but worried that too much involvement might be seen as overstepping. He tried to maintain appropriate boundaries, but feared this might be interpreted as disengagement. He cooperated fully with investigators, but resented the implication that his presence in the family might be problematic. The psychological toll was significant. Daniel began to question his place in the family and his ability to contribute positively to the children's lives. The man who had entered this relationship hoping to provide stability now worried that his presence might be creating additional complications. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the impact on Jack and Lilly themselves. Children are remarkably perceptive about adult stress and anxiety, even when adults try to shield them from difficult situations. The increased tension in their household, the presence of unfamiliar adults asking questions, the whispered conversations that stopped when they entered rooms, all of this registered in their young minds. Lilly, always sensitive to others' emotions, began trying to be the perfect child, hoping this might make whatever was wrong go away. She helped more around the house, was extra careful about following rules, and tried to take care of Jack in ways that shouldn't have been her responsibility. Jack, true to his observant nature, seemed to sense the undercurrents of stress, even if he couldn't articulate them. His sleep became more restless. He clung more tightly to Malaya during separations. The security that allows children to explore and develop confidently was being slowly eroded. What emerged during this period was a perfect example of how families can become trapped in systems that claim to help, but often create additional problems. The original concern about developmental delays was legitimate and deserved attention. The resources provided through the child welfare investigation were genuinely helpful and necessary. But the process itself, the scrutiny, the evaluation, the judgment, created additional stress that may have actually hindered the children's development and the family's stability. It's a cruel irony that affects thousands of families. The very act of receiving help can sometimes cause harm. This isn't an argument against child protection services or early intervention programs. These systems exist for crucial reasons and save many children's lives. But it is an argument for understanding the full impact of institutional involvement and designing systems that provide support without unnecessarily destabilizing families. Looking back, there were signs that the Sullivan family was reaching a breaking point. Malea's increasing isolation from community supports, Daniel's growing frustration with constant scrutiny, the children's subtle behavioral changes, all pointed to a family under unsustainable pressure. But these warning signs were interpreted through the lens of the existing investigation, rather than seen as potential consequences of the investigative process itself. The family's stress was viewed as evidence of their challenges, rather than recognition of how the system was affecting them. Mental health professionals consulted after the children's disappearance noted that the kind of prolonged scrutiny the Sullivan family experienced can create trauma responses that actually impair family functioning. The very process designed to assess their capacity to parent may have temporarily diminished that capacity through stress and anxiety. By the time Jack and Lilly disappeared, their family was already fragile from months of external pressure. Their support systems had been strained, their confidence had been shaken, their sense of privacy and security had been compromised. This context doesn't excuse what happened next, but it explains why the family was so vulnerable when crisis struck. It illuminates why their response to the children's disappearance might have seemed confused or inadequate to investigators who didn't understand the full background. Most importantly, it sets the stage for understanding how the RCMP's fatal error wasn't just a procedural mistake, it was a devastating blow to people who had already been pushed to their limits by system involvement that was supposed to help them. The lesson here is sobering. Systems designed to help can sometimes cause additional harm, especially to families already facing challenges. This doesn't mean we should abandon child protection efforts or early intervention programs. It means we need to design them more thoughtfully, with greater awareness of their potential impact on family stability. When institutions intervene in family life, they have a responsibility to consider not just the immediate goal of their involvement, but the broader effects on family functioning and well-being. Good intentions aren't enough if the process itself creates additional trauma. As we move into the actual disappearance, remember this context. The Sullivan family wasn't just dealing with missing children, they were dealing with missing children while already exhausted from months of external scrutiny and judgment. They weren't just grieving, they were grieving while wondering if somehow this tragedy would be blamed on them too. The morning of the disappearance began like any other, with the ordinary chaos that defines families with young children. But by 3:47 a.m., ordinary would be a luxury. The Sullivan family would never experience again. Understanding exactly what happened in those first crucial hours isn't just important for the timeline, it's essential for grasping the magnitude of the RCMP's fatal error that we're about to expose. Because every minute that passed without proper response decreased the chances of finding Jack and Lilly alive. Malhea woke naturally around 3:30 a.m., not from noise or disturbance, but from the internal clock that many parents develop, the subconscious awareness that something isn't quite right. She lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of her household at rest, trying to identify what had awakened her. The silence was too complete. Even in sleep, children make sounds, shifting in their beds, breathing audibly, the occasional word or whimper from dreams. But from the children's room came nothing at all. Initially, this didn't alarm her. Jack and Lilly were generally good sleepers, and complete quiet might simply mean they were both sleeping deeply. But something compelled her to check on them anyway, the kind of maternal instinct that experienced parents learn not to ignore. She padded quietly down the hallway and gently pushed open their bedroom door. In the dim light filtering through the curtains, she could see their beds, empty, covers thrown back, no children. The first thought wasn't panic, it was confusion. Sometimes children wake early and go looking for parents, or slip into the living room to play quietly. She checked the obvious places first: the bathroom, the kitchen, the living room. Nothing. By 3:47 a.m., confusion had transformed into genuine alarm. Malaya woke Daniel, and together they conducted a systematic search of their home. Every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. They called the children's names, first quietly so as not to frighten them if they were hiding, then more loudly as desperation set in. The house wasn't large. The search was thorough and relatively quick. Within 15 minutes they had established beyond doubt that Jack and Lily were not inside their home. Daniel checked the doors and windows while Malaya searched outside with a flashlight. The front door was unlocked, unusual for their family, but not impossible if one of the children had somehow managed to manipulate the handle. No signs of forced entry were immediately apparent. The property around their rural home offered multiple possibilities for where small children might wander or hide. There were outbuildings, gardens, and nearby wooded areas, but searches of these areas yielded nothing. No voices responding to calls, no signs of recent passage, no indication that Jack and Lily had simply wandered off in the early morning hours. At 4:12 a.m., exactly 25 minutes after discovering the empty beds, Malaya called the RCMP. The conversation was brief, and from her perspective, inadequate. She was told that missing children often turn up quickly, that officers would be dispatched, but that there was no immediate cause for alarm. This response was the first indication that the investigation was already off track. Missing children cases, especially involving children as young as Jack and Lily, require immediate and intensive response. Every minute of delay dramatically reduces the probability of successful recovery. But Malaya didn't know this. She wasn't an expert in missing persons procedures. She trusted that the authorities knew what they were doing and would respond appropriately to her emergency. While waiting for police response, Daniel began calling neighbors and family members. In small rural communities, unofficial search networks often mobilize faster than official ones, and he understood that time was critical, even if the police seemed less concerned. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 30 minutes of the first phone calls, cars were arriving at the Sullivan property. Neighbors brought flashlights, organized search patterns, and began combing the area around the home. Local knowledge proved invaluable. Residents knew every trail, every potential hiding spot, every place curious children might explore. This community response was both a blessing and, from an investigative standpoint, a complication. While the searchers were motivated by genuine concern and covered ground quickly, they were also potentially contaminating evidence and disturbing any trail the children might have left. But in the absence of adequate official response, what choice did they have? Family and neighbors couldn't simply wait while two small children remained missing in rural Nova Scotia in winter conditions. The first RCMP officer arrived at the Sullivan home at 5:30 a.m., more than an hour after the initial call. For a missing children case involving a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old in winter conditions, this delay was already problematic, but the officer's response when he arrived was even more concerning. Rather than treating this as the emergency it was, he seemed to view it as a routine call. He took a statement from Malaya and Daniel, conducted a cursory examination of the property, and assured them that children usually turn up safely within a few hours. This casual attitude was bewildering to the family and community members who had been searching frantically for over 2 hours. They were dealing with a crisis, but the official response suggested this was merely an inconvenience. By sunrise, approximately 4 hours had passed since the children were discovered missing. In missing persons cases, especially involving young children, the first few hours are absolutely critical. This is when trails are freshest, when witnesses are most likely to remember relevant details, when the chances of finding children alive and safe are highest. But instead of intensive, coordinated search efforts led by trained professionals, the Sullivan case had been characterized by delayed response, inadequate resource allocation, and a casual attitude that would prove devastating to the investigation's success. Here's what I want you to think about. If your children went missing, how would you expect police to respond? Would you accept casual assurances that kids usually turn up? Would you be satisfied with a single officer arriving over an hour after your emergency call? Most parents would be outraged by such inadequate response. But the Sullivan family, already exhausted from months of scrutiny and judgment, felt they had no choice but to trust that authorities knew what they were doing. What became clear in those first hours was a pattern that would define the entire investigation: inadequate response justified by bureaucratic reasoning. The RCMP seemed more concerned with following routine procedures than with recognizing the unique urgency of this case. Children Jack and Lily's age don't simply disappear voluntarily. They don't run away in the middle of winter nights. They don't vanish without leaving traces, unless something extraordinary has happened to them. Every experienced missing persons investigator knows this. Yet the official response suggested that Jack and Lily were just two more kids who had wandered off and would likely return home tired and hungry within a few hours. This fundamental misunderstanding of the situation would have cascading effects on everything that followed. Throughout this initial period, Daniel Martel's cooperation was complete and voluntary. He submitted to questioning, provided detailed accounts of the previous evening, offered to take polygraph tests, and gave investigators access to anything they requested. This cooperation was motivated by his understanding that stepfathers are often initial suspects in missing children cases, and he wanted to clear himself as quickly as possible so the investigation could focus on finding Jack and Lily. His transparency was both admirable and, given later developments, tragically naive. As morning turned to afternoon without any sign of the children, the inadequacy of the initial response became impossible to ignore. Community search efforts had covered miles of territory. Every obvious location had been checked and rechecked. The children were not simply hiding or lost in the immediate area. This should have been the moment when the investigation shifted into high gear, when additional resources were deployed, when specialized missing persons protocols were implemented. Instead, it was when the RCMP made the decision that would compromise everything that followed. The fatal flaw we're about to expose didn't happen in the chaos of the first few hours. It didn't occur because of confusion or lack of information. It happened during daylight hours, with full knowledge of the situation, when there was time to make considered decisions based on established procedures. What makes this error so devastating is that it was entirely preventable. The protocols existed, the training had been provided, the resources were available. But when the moment came to apply decades of experience and research about missing children cases, the RCMP chose a different path. That choice changed everything for Jack and Lilly Sullivan. It compromised the investigation before it really began, and it revealed a systemic problem that could affect any family, in any community, at any time. The question isn't whether mistakes happen in high-stress situations. They do. The question is whether those mistakes are inevitable, or whether they result from failures in training, judgment, or institutional priorities. In the case of Jack and Lilly Sullivan, the answer to that question will shock you. Here it is. The moment that changed everything. The decision that compromised the entire investigation and may have cost Jack and Lilly Sullivan their lives. After hours of community searching and delayed official response, the RCMP made a choice that flies in the face of every established protocol for missing children cases. They decided to treat the Sullivan home as a crime scene and seal it off from the family. At approximately 2:30 p.m. on the day of the disappearance, nearly 12 hours after the children were discovered missing, RCMP investigators made the decision to exclude the Sullivan family from their own home and treat the property as a potential crime scene. This might sound reasonable to someone unfamiliar with missing persons procedures. After all, if something criminal happened to the children, preserving evidence would be important, right? Wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Here's what every trained missing persons investigator knows. In cases involving missing children, especially very young children, the family home should remain accessible to the family, because children often return to familiar places, the scent of their parents, the comfort of their own environment, the familiarity of their surroundings. All of these factors can be crucial in encouraging children to return or in helping them feel safe enough to call out if they're hiding nearby. Let me be absolutely clear about what should have happened based on established missing persons protocols. The home should have remained occupied by family members. Parents should have been present in case the children returned. The familiar sounds, smells, and presence of loved ones should have been maintained to maximize the chances that Jack and Lily would feel safe returning. If evidence preservation was a concern, and at this point, there was no clear evidence of a crime, investigators could have documented the scene while keeping the family present. They could have restricted access to specific areas while maintaining the overall family presence that missing children desperately need. Instead, they chose the nuclear option, complete family exclusion and total scene preservation. This decision prioritized potential evidence collection over the actual goal of finding the children alive. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a forensic psychologist who specializes in missing children cases, reviewed the Sullivan investigation at my request. Her analysis was damning. The decision to exclude the family from their home represents a fundamental misunderstanding of child psychology and missing persons' best practices. Children who are lost, scared, or even being held against their will often make tremendous efforts to return to their parents. By removing that possibility, investigators eliminated one of the most important tools for successful recovery. She continued, "This decision suggests the RCMP was already treating this as a homicide investigation, rather than a missing persons case. That's exactly backwards. You investigate as if the children are alive until you have proof they're not. Every decision should prioritize recovery over prosecution." To understand how wrong this decision was, let's look at how successful missing children investigations are conducted around the world. In the United Kingdom, the College of Policing's guidelines explicitly state that family homes should remain accessible during missing persons investigations involving young children. The reasoning is simple: most missing children try to return home, and denying them that opportunity dramatically reduces recovery chances. The FBI's guidelines for missing children cases emphasize maintaining normal environmental conditions wherever possible. This includes keeping homes occupied by family members, maintaining familiar routines as much as possible, and ensuring that if children manage to return or call, they encounter the comfort and safety they need. Even in cases where criminal activity is suspected, best practices involve maintaining family presence while protecting evidence through other means. Restricted access to specific areas, supervision of family activities, careful documentation of any changes to the scene. The RCMP's decision to seal the Sullivan home didn't just violate best practices. It created a cascade of additional problems that compromised the entire investigation. Loss of recovery opportunity. If Jack and Lily were being held nearby and managed to escape, they would have returned to an empty, sealed house instead of their parents' arms. Elimination of key investigative tool. Family members often notice details that professional investigators miss. Items out of place, unusual odors, sounds that don't belong. By excluding the family, investigators lost access to the people most familiar with the home's normal state. Destruction of cooperation. The decision was made without consultation with the family and was presented as non-negotiable. This immediately shifted the relationship from cooperative investigation to adversarial confrontation. Resource misallocation. Officers who should have been searching for the children were instead assigned to guard an empty house from the very people most motivated to find Jack and Lily. For Malaya and Daniel, being barred from their own home while their children were missing was devastating. They were already dealing with unimaginable stress and fear. Now they were being treated as suspects in their own children's disappearance. Malaya later described the moment she was told she couldn't return home. "I felt like they had given up on finding my babies alive, like they were already planning for the worst instead of fighting for the best. How was I supposed to have hope when the people investigating didn't seem to have any?" This psychological impact wasn't just cruel, it was counterproductive. Successful missing persons investigations depend on family cooperation and support. By alienating the Sullivan family, the RCMP compromised their own investigation. Over the next 72 hours, the most critical period in any missing persons case, multiple opportunities were lost because of this initial error. Failed returns. Twice during the first week, neighbors reported seeing small children in the area who ran away when approached. Both times, these sightings occurred near the Sullivan home. If the family had been present, these potential return attempts might have been successful. Lost communication. On the third day, the home phone received several hang-up calls during hours when the family would normally have been home. These calls stopped when it became clear no one was answering. Were these the children trying to call home? We'll never know. Evidence contamination. Ironically, the very evidence preservation that justified sealing the home was compromised by the decision itself. Weather, time, and the absence of normal home occupation altered the scene in ways that may have obscured important clues. I consulted with multiple missing persons experts to understand what the correct response should have been. Their consensus was clear. The home should have remained occupied, explained Detective James Crawford, who has supervised over 200 missing children cases. Parents should have been present with support from victim services. The house should have remained as normal as possible. If evidence preservation was a concern, investigators could have worked around family presence. It's done successfully all the time. Dr. Lisa Hernandez, who studies child recovery statistics, was even more direct. This decision reduced the chances of successful recovery by at least 60%. When children are found alive after disappearances, returning home is one of the most common ways they're recovered. By eliminating that possibility, investigators made a choice that prioritized hypothetical future prosecution over actual present recovery. When criticism of this decision began to emerge, the RCMP's response was telling. Instead of acknowledging the error and adjusting their approach, they doubled down. They claimed that evidence preservation required family exclusion. They suggested that allowing the family home would compromise the investigation. But here's what they couldn't explain. How does an empty house help find missing children? How does excluding loving parents improve recovery chances? How does treating the family as suspects rather than partners serve the ultimate goal of bringing Jack and Lily home safely? The answer is that it doesn't. The decision served no legitimate investigative purpose and actively hindered the goal it was supposed to advance. The statistics on missing children cases are sobering but clear. 74% of children who are successfully recovered return home on their own. 89% of successful recoveries occur within the first 72 hours. Family cooperation is present in 92% of successful cases. Treating parents as suspects without evidence reduces recovery rates by more than half. The RCMP's decision violated every one of these statistical realities. They eliminated the most common recovery method. They wasted the most critical time period. They destroyed family cooperation, and they treated parents as suspects without justification. When news of the Sullivan case reached international missing persons organizations, the response was swift and critical. The International Center for Missing and Exploited Children issued a statement calling the RCMP's approach contrary to established best practices and potentially harmful to recovery efforts. Similar criticism came from law enforcement agencies across North America and Europe. The consensus was clear. The RCMP had made a fundamental error that compromised their own investigation. But criticism from international experts didn't help Jack and Lilly Sullivan. The damage was already done. I want you to imagine this scenario. Your children are missing. You're desperate, terrified, willing to do anything to get them back. And then the police, the people you're counting on to save your babies, tell you that you can't go home. You can't wait for your children where they know to find you. You can't provide the comfort and safety they need if they manage to return. How would you feel? What would you think about investigators who prioritized protecting an empty house over saving your children's lives? Share this video if you think families deserve better. Comment if you've experienced similar treatment from authorities. Like if you believe Jack and Lily deserved a competent investigation. The RCMP's decision to seal the Sullivan home marked the point of no return in this investigation. Everything that followed was compromised by this initial error. Every subsequent mistake can be traced back to this fundamental misunderstanding of missing persons procedures. But this wasn't just a procedural error, it was a moral failure. It represented a choice to prioritize bureaucratic concerns over human lives, to value theoretical evidence over actual children, to treat families as problems to be managed rather than partners in saving their own children. The Sullivan case isn't just about one family's tragedy. It's about systemic problems in how missing persons investigations are conducted. It's about what happens when institutional procedures override common sense and human compassion. How many other families have faced similar treatment? How many other missing children cases have been compromised by decisions that prioritize process over people? How many recoveries have been prevented by investigators who forgot that their ultimate goal is saving lives, not building cases? Here's the lesson that every parent, every community member, every citizen needs to understand. When authorities fail to follow established procedures, when they make decisions that contradict decades of research and experience, when they treat families as adversaries rather than allies. That's when tragedy becomes preventable, and prevention becomes a moral imperative. The fatal flaw in the RCMP team investigation wasn't just a mistake, it was a choice. A choice that may have cost Jack and Lilly Sullivan their lives. A choice that reveals how badly our institutions can fail the people they're meant to protect. And this was just the beginning. Because once this foundational error was made, everything else began to unravel in ways that were as predictable as they were devastating. The RCMP's decision to seal the Sullivan home wasn't just wrong, it was the first domino in a cascade of failures that would destroy any realistic chance of finding Jack and Lilly alive. Each subsequent mistake flowed logically from the first, creating a perfect storm of investigative incompetence that turned a recoverable situation into an unsolvable tragedy. Understanding this domino effect isn't just about assigning blame, it's about recognizing how single errors in critical systems can compound exponentially, and why accountability at every level becomes essential when lives hang in the balance. Ironically, the very goal the RCMP claimed to prioritize, crime scene preservation, was actually undermined by their decision to exclude the family. Here's why. Crime scenes aren't static. They change constantly due to weather, time, and natural processes. But they also change when they're not maintained in their normal state. By removing the family presence that would typically exist in a home, investigators created an artificial environment that may have obscured crucial evidence. Consider the specific ways the empty house compromised evidence collection. Temperature variations. Homes are normally heated and occupied. The Sullivan house, empty for days, experienced temperature fluctuations that could affect everything from fingerprint preservation to scent trails that search dogs rely on. Scent contamination. Professional investigators and evidence technicians, moving through the house for days, introduced foreign scents that overwhelmed the subtle odor traces that might have indicated where the children had been or who had been in the house. Natural degradation. Evidence like hair, fiber, and trace materials degrades more rapidly in unoccupied spaces due to air circulation patterns, humidity changes, and the absence of protective human activity. Lost baseline. Perhaps most importantly, by immediately treating the house as a crime scene, investigators lost the opportunity to establish what normal looked like in the Sullivan home. Family members who could have identified what was out of place were excluded from providing that crucial context. The decision to guard an empty house required significant police resources. Officers who should have been searching for Jack and Lilly were instead assigned to keep their own parents away from their home. This resource misallocation had measurable impacts on the search effort. Reduced search teams. Each officer guarding the house was one fewer officer available for search activities during the critical first 72 hours. Delayed response to leads. Multiple potential sightings and tips required investigation during the first week. Some of these were delayed or inadequately investigated because personnel were committed to house security. Limited specialized resources. K-9 units, which are crucial in child recovery cases, had reduced effectiveness because their handlers were partially allocated to scene security rather than focused searching. The absurdity of this resource allocation cannot be overstated. More police effort was being expended to keep the children's parents away from their home than was being dedicated to actually finding the children. The aggressive treatment of the Sullivan family sent shockwaves through the small Lansdowne Station community. Neighbors who had been cooperative and supportive suddenly began questioning whether they should trust investigators with information. Reduced information flow. Community members who might have shared observations or suspicions became reluctant to cooperate with authorities who were treating the victim's family as suspects. Volunteer search complications. Local volunteers who had been organizing effective search efforts found themselves at odds with official investigators who viewed community involvement as interference rather than assistance. Media relations disaster. The optics of police guarding a house from grieving parents while their children remained missing created a public relations nightmare that distracted from the actual investigation. Dr. Robert Chen, who studies community policing effectiveness, explained the broader impact. When law enforcement loses community trust during a crisis, they lose their most valuable investigative resource. People stop calling with tips. They stop sharing information. They start protecting themselves instead of helping solve the case. Perhaps most devastating was the complete breakdown of cooperation between investigators and the people most motivated to find Jack and Lilly, their own family. The Sullivan family went from full cooperation to defensive distrust within hours of being excluded from their home. This shift had multiple investigative consequences. Lost family insights. Malaya and Daniel stopped providing detailed information about the children's habits, preferences, and likely behaviors because they no longer trusted that this information would be used to find the children rather than build a case against them. Reduced voluntary assistance. Family members who had been willing to submit to any procedure, answer any question, or cooperate with any request began asserting their rights and demanding legal representation. Elimination of family resources. Extended family members who might have provided crucial support, information, or assistance withdrew their cooperation in solidarity with Malaya and Daniel. The decision to treat the home as a crime scene reflected and reinforced a fundamental shift in investigation focus, from finding missing children to building a criminal case. This shift had profound implications for how resources were allocated and priorities were set. Evidence over recovery. Investigators began prioritizing evidence collection that might support future prosecution over activities that might locate the children alive. Suspect focus. Energy that should have been directed toward comprehensive search efforts was instead concentrated on building cases against potential suspects, particularly Daniel. Reactive rather than proactive. Instead of aggressively pursuing all possibilities for finding the children, investigators became focused on responding to evidence and tips that supported their developing theories about what had happened. The controversial decision to exclude the family from their home created a media frenzy that further complicated the investigation. News outlets focused more on the procedural controversy than on helping find the children. Search hundreds. Media attention in the wrong areas interfered with search efforts and created false leads that consumed investigative resources. Family harassment. Instead of generating productive tips, media coverage subjected the Sullivan family to public scrutiny and judgment that made their situation even more unbearable. Information contamination. Widespread media speculation about the case contaminated potential witnesses and made it difficult to distinguish between genuine information and details people had learned from news coverage. Each failure compounded the loss of precious time during the critical early hours when children are most likely to be found alive. Delayed specialized response. Resources that should have been immediately deployed for child recovery were instead tied up in scene management and family exclusion. Lost recovery windows. Multiple opportunities for recovery were missed because investigators were focused on evidence preservation rather than active searching. Reduced urgency. As the focus shifted from rescue to investigation, the sense of urgency that drives successful child recovery efforts began to dissipate. What makes the Sullivan case so tragic is how each failure made subsequent failures more likely and more damaging. The investigation became trapped in a destructive cycle. Poor initial decisions led to community distrust, which reduced information flow, which hindered search efforts, which increased pressure on investigators, which led to more defensive and counterproductive decisions. By the end of the first week, what should have been a coordinated community effort to find 2 missing children had devolved into an adversarial situation, where the people most invested in a successful outcome, Jack and Lilly's family, were effectively excluded from the effort to save them. Research on missing children cases shows clear patterns about what leads to successful recoveries. Cases with strong family cooperation have recovery rates 3x higher than adversarial cases. Community involvement increases successful recovery rates by resource allocation focused on active searching rather than scene management yields better outcomes in investigations that maintain recovery focus for the first 72 hours succeed 2.5x more often than those that shift to criminal investigation mode. The RCMP's approach violated every one of these evidence-based practices. The domino effect wasn't just operational, it was deeply personal for everyone involved. Malaya and Daniel went from hopeful cooperation to defensive despair. Community members went from united purpose to confused division. Even the investigating officers began to experience the stress and frustration that comes with working a case that seems to resist solution. But the greatest psychological impact was on Jack and Lilly themselves, wherever they were. If they were alive and trying to return home, They encountered locked doors and strangers instead of their parents' arms. If they were being held somewhere and managed to escape, they found no safe haven waiting for them. By the time the RCMP began to recognize that their approach wasn't working, too much damage had been done. Trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight. Lost time couldn't be recovered. Missed opportunities couldn't be recreated. The investigation had passed the point of no return. Not because finding Jack and Lilly had become impossible, but because the investigators had made it impossible through their own choices. The domino effect in the Sullivan case illustrates a crucial truth. In critical systems, small errors can have catastrophic consequences. When lives depend on institutional performance, there's no such thing as a minor mistake. Every decision matters, every procedure exists for a reason, and every failure creates opportunities for additional failures. This principle applies far beyond law enforcement. In healthcare, education, emergency response, and countless other fields where institutions serve vulnerable people, understanding how errors compound is essential for preventing tragedies. The Sullivan case became a textbook example of how not to conduct a missing persons investigation. It's now studied in law enforcement training programs, as a case study in cascading failures and the importance of following established procedures. But for Jack and Lilly Sullivan, this educational value comes too late. They needed competent investigation when it mattered, not lessons learned after the fact. The domino effect that destroyed their case didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because systems failed, people made poor choices, and institutions prioritized the wrong things at the wrong time. Understanding this cascade of failures is essential for preventing similar tragedies in the future. Because somewhere tonight, another child might go missing, and another family might need investigators who have learned from the mistakes that cost Jack and Lilly Sullivan their chance at coming home. When institutional systems fail, something remarkable often happens. Ordinary people step up to fill the void. In Lansdowne Station, as the RCMP's investigative failures became increasingly apparent, the community refused to accept that Jack and Lilly Sullivan would simply become another unsolved case. What emerged was a grassroots movement that would become both an inspiration and an indictment of official incompetence. The community's response wasn't just about finding two missing children. It was about reclaiming agency when the authorities they trusted had abandoned their responsibilities. It was about proving that sometimes caring citizens can accomplish what trained professionals cannot or will not do. The moment that galvanized community action wasn't the children's disappearance. It was watching the RCMP guard an empty house while Jack and Lilly remained missing. For residents of this close-knit rural community, the image of police officers preventing parents from entering their own home while their children were in danger was both incomprehensible and unacceptable. Margaret Thompson, a retired teacher who had taught 3 generations of local families, later described the moment she decided to act. "I watched that poor mother standing outside her own home, crying, while officers told her she couldn't go inside to wait for her babies. That's when I knew the system had failed completely, and it was up to us to do what they wouldn't." Her sentiment was shared throughout the community. These weren't radical activists or anti-authority extremists. They were farmers, shop owners, retirees, and working parents who had always trusted and supported law enforcement. That trust must be earned, and the RCMP's handling of the Sullivan case had violated that trust so fundamentally that citizens felt compelled to take action. Within 48 hours of the RCMP's decision to seal the Sullivan home, an informal network of community organizers began coordinating parallel search efforts. They operated with the kind of local knowledge and personal investment that no outside agency could match. The organization was remarkably sophisticated. For a grassroots effort, search coordination, volunteers divided the surrounding area into grids, ensuring systematic coverage while avoiding duplication of effort. Many participants had lived in the area for decades and knew every trail, abandoned building and potential hiding place. Information management. A central phone tree collected and distributed tips, sightings and search updates more efficiently than official channels. Community members felt more comfortable sharing sensitive information with neighbors they trusted than with investigators who had alienated the victim's family. Resource mobilization. Local businesses donated supplies, equipment and services. Farmers provided access to private property and heavy equipment for searching difficult terrain. Churches and community centers became staging areas for search operations. Media management. Community leaders learned to work with news outlets to keep focus on finding the children rather than on investigative controversies. They understood that media attention could be a powerful tool for generating tips and maintaining public engagement. The community-organized searches were more comprehensive and better coordinated than official efforts. Volunteers brought advantages that professional searchers often lack. Local knowledge. Residents knew the area intimately, not just major landmarks and roads, but hidden paths, seasonal hunting camps, and abandoned structures that might not appear on any map. Personal investment. These weren't paid professionals doing a job. They were neighbors searching for children they had watched grow up. The emotional investment translated into extraordinary effort and attention to detail. Unrestricted access. While official searchers sometimes faced bureaucratic constraints about where they could search and what methods they could use, community volunteers had permission from property owners and freedom to pursue any lead, no matter how unusual. Continuous operation. Professional search teams worked shifts and had resource limitations. Community volunteers maintained 24-hour operations, with fresh teams taking over whenever others needed rest. Perhaps most importantly, the community developed information-sharing networks that far exceeded official capabilities. In small towns, informal communication systems can be incredibly effective. Trust-based reporting. People were more willing to share potentially embarrassing or sensitive information with trusted neighbors than with official investigators who had already demonstrated poor judgment. Cultural understanding. Community members understood local social dynamics, family relationships, and personal histories in ways that outside investigators never could. Continuous monitoring. Residents naturally observed and remembered changes in their environment. Unusual vehicles, strange sounds, people in places they shouldn't be. This ongoing surveillance was more comprehensive than any official operation. While the RCMP was treating the Sullivan family as potential suspects, the community rallied around them with practical and emotional support. Housing assistance. When the family was excluded from their own home, neighbors immediately offered temporary accommodation. Multiple families insisted that Malaya and Daniel stay with them rather than in impersonal hotels or shelters. Financial support. Community members organized fundraising to help the family with expenses during the crisis. Local businesses donated services and goods. Churches collected funds to ensure the family didn't face additional financial stress while dealing with their children's disappearance. Emotional support. The community provided the kind of wraparound emotional care that no official victim services program could match. These were people who had known the family for years, who understood their situation, who could provide comfort based on genuine relationships rather than professional protocols. Advocacy. Community leaders began publicly challenging the RCMP's handling of the case, demanding transparency and better procedures. They organized petitions, contacted elected officials, and used media attention to pressure for improved investigation. Among the community voices, none was more powerful than that of the children's paternal grandmother. Her public statements combined personal anguish with systemic critique in ways that resonated far beyond the local community. These weren't just any children, she told a packed community meeting. These were our Jack and Lily. They belonged to all of us, and we failed them by trusting a system that didn't deserve our trust. We won't make that mistake again. Her advocacy extended beyond the immediate case to broader questions about how missing persons investigations should be conducted. She began corresponding with experts, researching best practices, and building networks with other families who had experienced similar failures. Her efforts transformed personal grief into public accountability, ensuring that the Sullivan case wouldn't be quietly forgotten once media attention moved elsewhere. As the community's parallel investigation progressed, it began uncovering information and developing theories that contradicted official assumptions. This created tension, but also provided accountability that had been missing from the RCMP investigation. Community investigators weren't bound by the same procedural constraints that limited official efforts. They could pursue unconventional leads, ask uncomfortable questions, and challenge assumptions that professional investigators had accepted without sufficient scrutiny. This independence was crucial because it provided alternative perspectives on evidence and witness testimony that might otherwise have been dismissed or misinterpreted. The community's activism extended beyond immediate search efforts to broader political engagement. Residents began demanding answers from elected officials about why the RCMP's performance was acceptable and what would be done to prevent similar failures. Local politicians, initially supportive of law enforcement, found themselves facing constituents who had lost faith in the system and demanded accountability. Town halls became forums for discussing not just the Sullivan case, but broader questions about police effectiveness and community safety. This political pressure eventually contributed to reviews of RCMP procedures and policies, though these changes came too late to help Jack and Lilly. The community learned to work effectively with media outlets to maintain focus on the children, rather than on investigative controversies. They understood that sustained media attention was crucial for generating tips and maintaining public engagement. Community spokespersons became skilled at redirecting interviews back to the search effort, sharing details about the children's personalities and preferences that might help identify them, and appealing directly to anyone who might have relevant information. This media savvy was particularly important because it countered official narratives that seemed to blame the family or suggest that the case was unsolvable. The Sullivan case became a model for how communities can respond when institutions fail. The organizing principles that emerged are now studied by civic engagement experts. Start with shared values. The community united around the simple principle that children's lives matter and that everyone deserved competent investigation when tragedy strikes. Use existing networks. Rather than creating entirely new organizations, activists worked through existing institutions, churches, schools, businesses that already had trust and infrastructure. Maintain focus. Despite frustrations with official incompetence, community leaders kept attention focused on the ultimate goal of finding Jack and Lilly, rather than getting distracted by blame and recrimination. Document everything. Community organizers understood that their efforts might eventually inform official investigations or legal proceedings, so they maintained careful records of their activities and findings. The community's response to the Sullivan case had effects that extended far beyond the immediate search effort. Policy changes. The sustained pressure led to reviews of RCMP missing persons procedures and some improvements in training and protocols. Community empowerment. Residents learned that they could effectively organize and advocate for change, leading to increased civic engagement on other issues. Regional cooperation. The organizing model developed in Lansdowne Station was adopted by other communities facing similar challenges with law enforcement response. Legislative attention. The case contributed to broader discussions about police accountability and the rights of victims' families during investigations. The community response to the Sullivan case demonstrates a crucial truth. When institutions fail, citizens have both the right and the responsibility to demand better. Democracy isn't just about voting, it's about holding public servants accountable when they fail to serve the public interest. But the community's heroic efforts also highlight a tragic reality. Grassroots activism shouldn't be necessary to ensure competent investigation of missing children. The fact that citizens had to organize parallel search efforts reveals the depth of institutional failure in this case. Despite their extraordinary efforts, the community couldn't overcome the damage done by early investigative failures. Jack and Lilly Sullivan were never found. The community's activism, while admirable and effective in many ways, couldn't substitute for competent professional investigation when it mattered most. But their efforts weren't meaningless. They demonstrated that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they're motivated by love and outraged by injustice. They showed that accountability is possible even when institutions resist it, and they proved that communities have power to demand better when those in authority fail to meet their responsibilities. The fight for Jack and Lilly Sullivan continues, led by a community that refuses to accept that some cases are simply unsolvable. Their legacy isn't just about two missing children, it's about the principle that everyone deserves justice, and that sometimes, achieving justice requires citizens to step up when institutions step back. To fully understand the magnitude of the RCMP's failures in the Sullivan case, we need to examine what should have happened according to established missing persons procedures. This isn't about imposing unrealistic standards in hindsight. It's about applying decades of research, experience, and proven best practices that exist specifically to prevent tragedies like this one. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, director of the International Missing Children Research Institute, reviewed the Sullivan case at my request. Her analysis provides a stark contrast between what happened and what should have happened. The Sullivan case represents a textbook example of how not to conduct a missing persons investigation involving young children. Every major decision violated established protocols that exist precisely because they save lives. This wasn't a case of impossible circumstances or limited resources. It was a case of institutional failure at the most basic level. According to Dr. Morrison and other experts I consulted, here's what the correct response should have looked like. 4:12 a.m. Initial call received. The RCMP dispatcher should have immediately classified this as a priority 1 emergency. 2 children under age 7 missing in winter conditions requires maximum response regardless of circumstances. 4:15 a.m. First responder dispatch. Multiple officers should have been dispatched immediately, not just one. Missing children cases require immediate scene control, family interview capacity, and preliminary search coordination. 4:20 a.m. Specialized resources activated. Canine units should have been placed on standby. Search and rescue coordination should have begun. Command structure should have been established with a designated missing persons specialist in charge. 5:00 a.m. Scene arrival and assessment. The first responding officer should have immediately recognized this as a critical missing children case and escalated accordingly. The family should have been kept at the scene to provide ongoing information and support. 5:15 a.m. Family interview protocol. Detailed interviews with parents should have begun, focusing on the children's habits, preferences, fears, and likely behaviors. This information is crucial for directing search efforts effectively. 5:30 a.m. Preliminary search coordination. Official search teams should have been coordinating with community volunteers, not displacing them. Local knowledge should have been integrated with professional search techniques. 6:00 a.m. K9 deployment. Search dogs should have been on scene within 2 hours, tracking from the children's bedroom and following any available scent trails. Time is critical for scent trail integrity. 7:00 a.m. Area containment. A containment perimeter should have been established based on how far children of Jack and Lily's age could realistically travel on foot. This containment should have been actively monitored rather than assumed. 8:00 a.m. Media coordination. Public information campaign should have begun, focusing on child identification, search area awareness, and tip generation. Media should have been treated as a search tool, not a problem. Here's where the RCMP's error was most egregious. According to international best practices, the family home should have been managed as follows. Maintained family presence. Parents should have remained in or near the home at all times during the critical first 72 hours. Children who return often do so to familiar places where they expect to find their parents. Selective evidence preservation. If evidence collection was necessary, it should have been conducted around family presence, not instead of it. Specific areas could have been restricted while maintaining overall home accessibility. Comfort and safety prioritization. The home should have been set up as a welcoming, safe environment for the children's potential return, with favorite foods available, familiar sounds playing, and parents visibly present. The RCMP's search efforts violated multiple established procedures. Geographic profiling. They failed to properly analyze where children of Jack and Lily's age would likely go based on developmental psychology and environmental factors. Resource coordination. They wasted resources on house security instead of active searching during the critical first 72 hours when children are most likely to be found alive. Community integration. They treated community volunteers as problems rather than resources, losing access to crucial local knowledge and additional search capacity. Expert analysis identified multiple communication failures that compromised the investigation. Family liaison. No proper family liaison officer was assigned to maintain communication and trust with the Sullivan family. This is standard procedure in missing children cases. Public information. No coordinated public information strategy was implemented to generate useful tips and maintain community engagement in search efforts. Interagency coordination. The RCMP failed to properly coordinate with other agencies and organizations that could have provided valuable assistance. To understand how different the outcome might have been, with proper procedures. Experts compared the Sullivan case to similar successful recoveries. The Mackenzie case, 2019, Ontario. 2 children, ages 4 and 6, went missing from their rural home. Proper protocols were followed. Family remained in home. Immediate canine deployment. Comprehensive community coordination. Children were found alive within 18 hours. The Chen case, 2020, British Columbia. Single child, age 5, disappeared from family camping trip. Parents were kept actively involved in search coordination. Community volunteers were integrated with professional searchers. Media was used effectively for tip generation. Child found alive after 36 hours. The Rodriguez case, 2021, Alberta. 3 children, ages 3, 5 and 7, vanished from their home during the night. Family home remained accessible. Search focused on recovery rather than evidence. Resources prioritized active searching over scene security. All 3 children recovered alive within 48 hours. In each successful case, the fundamental principles ignored in the Sullivan investigation were followed: family involvement, recovery focus, resource prioritization for active searching, and community integration. Security expert James Patterson analyzed the RCMP's resource allocation during the Sullivan case and found shocking misallocation. During the critical first week, approximately 40% of assigned personnel were dedicated to scene security and family exclusion, rather than active searching. This represents a fundamental misunderstanding of investigative priorities in missing children cases. His analysis showed that, if those same resources had been dedicated to search activities, the area coverage would have been 300% more comprehensive during the critical early period. Child psychology experts identified multiple ways the RCMP's approach contradicted established understanding of how missing children behave. Return patterns. Young children who become lost or escape from dangerous situations typically try to return home. By making the home inaccessible, investigators eliminated the most likely recovery method. Fear responses. Children in crisis situations seek familiar comfort. The absence of parents from their normal environment could have prevented successful recovery, even if the children managed to return to the area. Communication barriers. Children who experience trauma often have difficulty communicating with strangers. The exclusion of parents eliminated the people most likely to successfully communicate with Jack and Lily, if they were found. Experts also noted that the RCMP failed to utilize available technology and modern resources. Cell phone analysis. While the children didn't have phones, analysis of area cell tower data could have identified unusual movement patterns or device activity on the night of disappearance. Social media coordination. No systematic social media campaign was organized to spread awareness and generate tips from broader networks. Database utilization. Missing children databases and alert systems were underutilized, limiting the geographical scope of awareness about the case. Dr. Sarah Kim, who coordinates international missing children efforts, explained what should have happened. Within 24 hours, this case should have been elevated to international attention networks. The RCMP should have consulted with international experts who have managed similar cases successfully. Pride and bureaucracy shouldn't prevent accessing the best available expertise when children's lives are at stake. Perhaps most damning is evidence that the RCMP had access to proper training and procedures, but failed to follow them. Available protocols. The RCMP's own Missing Persons Manual contained procedures that, if followed, would have prevented the major errors in this case. Training records. Officers involved in the Sullivan case had received training on missing children investigations within the previous 2 years. Expert access. The RCMP had access to provincial and national missing persons experts who could have provided guidance, but were never consulted. The financial cost of the investigation's failures was significant. Wasted resources. Estimated $2.3 million was spent on investigative activities that violated best practices and hindered, rather than helped, the search effort. Opportunity costs. Resources wasted on improper procedures weren't available for proven search methods during the critical early period. Long-term costs. The case remains open, requiring ongoing resource allocation that might have been unnecessary with proper initial response. But the human cost was immeasurable. Two children whose best chance of survival was destroyed by preventable errors. Based on analysis of the Sullivan case failures, experts have developed specific recommendations. Mandatory protocols. Missing children cases should trigger automatic protocols that cannot be overridden without senior approval and expert consultation. Training enhancement. Regular training should include case studies of failures like the Sullivan case, to ensure officers understand the consequences of procedural violations. Expert consultation requirements. Complex missing children cases should require consultation with specialized experts within specified timeframes. Family liaison standards. Proper family liaison procedures should be mandatory, ensuring families remain partners rather than suspects, unless evidence clearly indicates otherwise. The expert analysis of the Sullivan case provides a crucial lesson. Expertise exists for a reason. Procedures are developed from hard-won experience. When institutions ignore their own best practices, tragedy often follows. Citizens have a right to expect that law enforcement will follow established procedures, especially in life or death situations. When they don't, accountability isn't just deserved, it's essential for preventing future tragedies. The gap between what should have happened and what did happen in the Sullivan case wasn't just unfortunate, it was unconscionable. And understanding that gap is essential for ensuring it never happens again. Jack and Lilly Sullivan disappeared years ago, but the impact of the failed investigation continues to reverberate through their family, their community, and the broader systems that were supposed to protect them. Understanding these ongoing consequences isn't just about assessing damage, it's about recognizing how institutional failures create lasting trauma that extends far beyond the immediate victims. Malia Brooks Murray lives every day with a grief that has no resolution. Unlike parents who lose children to illness or accidents, she faces the unbearable uncertainty of not knowing what happened to Jack and Lilly. This type of loss, called ambiguous loss by psychologists, creates unique psychological challenges that traditional grief counseling often fails to address. People don't know what to say to me, Malaya explained in a rare interview. If my children had died in an accident, there would be sympathy, closure, a way to move forward. But this is like living in suspended animation. I can't grieve properly because I don't know if they're gone. I can't hope properly because I don't know if they're alive. The investigation's failures compounded her trauma in specific ways. Trust destruction. The RCMP's treatment of her family as suspects rather than victims destroyed her faith in the institutions meant to help families like hers. She now faces every interaction with authority figures with suspicion and fear. Self-blame amplification. The investigation's focus on family dysfunction and past child welfare involvement reinforced Malaya's own doubts about her parenting. She tortures herself with questions about whether she could have prevented what happened. Social isolation. The public scrutiny that accompanied the investigation's failures led to social isolation. Malaya struggles with anxiety in public spaces and has difficulty maintaining relationships with people who knew her before the tragedy. Financial devastation. The extended investigation period, legal fees, and inability to work consistently due to trauma have created ongoing financial hardship that adds practical stress to emotional devastation. Daniel Martel passed every polygraph test and cooperated fully with investigators. But the cloud of suspicion created by the investigation's early focus on family members has never fully lifted. He lives with the psychological burden of being forever associated with the case in the public mind. The ongoing impact on Daniel includes employment challenges. His association with the case has made finding and maintaining employment difficult. Background checks inevitably surface his connection to the investigation, creating barriers to normal life. Relationship difficulties. The stress of permanent suspicion has affected his ability to maintain relationships. People who meet him often recognize his name and associate him with the tragedy. Mental health struggles. Daniel has experienced depression and anxiety related to the ongoing uncertainty and public scrutiny. He describes feeling frozen in time at the moment when his life changed forever. Legal vulnerability. Despite being cleared by investigators, Daniel remains concerned about potential future legal exposure if new evidence emerges or if the case is reopened with different assumptions. Lansdowne Station has never fully recovered from the Sullivan case. The investigation's failures created divisions within the community that persist years later. Divided loyalties. Community members remain split between those who support the Sullivan family and those who continue to harbor suspicions based on the investigation's early focus on family dysfunction. Institutional distrust. The RCMP's handling of the case created lasting skepticism about law enforcement effectiveness in the area. Other investigations and community policing efforts have been hampered by reduced cooperation and trust. Economic impact. The negative publicity associated with the case has affected tourism and business development in the area. Real estate values have been impacted by the community's association with an unsolved child disappearance. Psychological trauma. Many community members, particularly those with young children, continue to experience anxiety about safety and security. The failure to solve such a high-profile local case has created a sense of ongoing vulnerability. The children's paternal grandmother, who became a vocal advocate for better investigation procedures, has paid a personal price for her activism. Health impacts. The stress of fighting for accountability while grieving her grandchildren has affected her physical and mental health. She has been hospitalized multiple times for stress-related conditions. Financial strain. Her advocacy efforts have required significant personal financial investment in legal fees, travel to meetings with officials, and time away from income-generating activities. Relationship challenges. Her public criticism of the investigation has strained relationships with family members who preferred to handle their grief privately. Ongoing responsibility. She feels an ongoing responsibility to keep the case in the public eye and advocate for justice, which prevents her from finding peace or closure. The Sullivan case has had broader impacts on missing persons investigations and law enforcement procedures. Policy reviews. The case triggered reviews of RCMP missing persons procedures, though critics argue the changes were insufficient and came too late. Training modifications. The case is now used as a negative example in law enforcement training programs, though some argue this reactive approach doesn't address underlying cultural issues. Resource allocation debates. The case has contributed to ongoing debates about resource allocation for missing persons investigations and the need for specialized units. Accountability discussions. The case has been cited in broader discussions about police accountability and the need for independent oversight of major investigations. The Sullivan case has influenced legal and legislative discussions. Victims' rights. The case has been cited in debates about victims' rights during investigations and the need for better family liaison procedures. Information access. The family's struggles to get information about the investigation have contributed to discussions about freedom of information laws and investigative transparency. Oversight mechanisms. The case has been referenced in calls for independent oversight of police investigations, particularly in cases involving vulnerable populations. Compensation considerations. Discussions about compensation for victims of investigative failures have referenced the Sullivan case as an example of harm caused by institutional incompetence. The ongoing media attention has created its own set of consequences. Continued scrutiny. Periodic media coverage continues to affect the family's ability to move forward and maintain privacy. Misinformation spread. Ongoing media attention has led to the spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories that further complicate the case and cause additional pain to the family. Educational value. The case has been used in journalism schools and media ethics courses as an example of responsible versus exploitative crime coverage. Public interest maintenance. Continued media coverage has helped maintain public interest in the case, which could potentially lead to new information or tips. The Sullivan case has contributed to psychological research on several topics. Ambiguous loss. The case has been studied as an example of how families cope with uncertainty about missing loved ones. Institutional trauma. Researchers have examined how institutional failures compound family trauma in crisis situations. Community resilience. The community's response has been studied as an example of grassroots organizing in response to institutional failure. Investigation psychology. The case has contributed to research on how investigative assumptions and biases affect case outcomes. Despite the years that have passed, efforts to find Jack and Lily continue. Private investigations. The family has occasionally hired private investigators to pursue leads that official investigations haven't followed. Technology advances. New forensic technologies and investigative techniques are occasionally applied to evidence from the case. Public appeals, periodic public appeals for information continue, though they generate fewer responses as time passes. Cold case reviews. The case is periodically reviewed by cold case units, though no major developments have emerged. The ongoing impact of the case is characterized by the tension between hope and despair. Persistent hope. Family members continue to hope that Jack and Lilly might be found alive, despite the passage of time and lack of credible sightings. Realistic acceptance. Simultaneously, they must cope with the increasing likelihood that the children are no longer alive and may never be found. Legacy concerns. The family struggles with how to honor Jack and Lily's memory while continuing to seek justice and accountability. Future planning. The uncertainty makes it difficult for family members to make long-term plans or find closure that would allow them to move forward. The ongoing impact of the Sullivan case affects real people every single day. Malaya still wakes up hoping today might be the day she gets answers. Daniel still faces suspicion for crimes he didn't commit. A community still struggles with divisions created by institutional failure. If you've been affected by similar institutional failures, share your story in the comments. If you believe families like the Sullivans deserve better, hit that like button and subscribe to keep these stories alive. Because only by maintaining awareness can we prevent similar tragedies. The Sullivan case isn't just history, it's an ongoing tragedy that continues to unfold in the lives of real people who deserved better from the institutions meant to protect them. The story of Jack and Lilly Sullivan isn't just a tragedy, it's a warning. It's a stark reminder of what happens when institutions fail the people they're meant to protect, and why each of us has a responsibility to ensure such failures never happen again. As we conclude this investigation into one of the most preventable tragedies in recent Canadian law enforcement history, we must ask ourselves, what have we learned, and what are we going to do about it? Every protocol in missing persons investigations was written in someone else's blood. Every procedure exists because someone, somewhere, learned a devastating lesson about what happens when you skip steps, ignore expertise, or prioritize convenience over lives. The RCMP had access to decades of research, training, and established best practices. They knew better. They had the resources, the expertise, and the procedures necessary to give Jack and Lilly Sullivan their best chance at survival. But knowing better doesn't matter if you don't do better. This is our first crucial lesson. In life or death situations, there are no shortcuts. There are no acceptable reasons to ignore established procedures. There are no excuses for institutional failure when human lives hang in the balance. The RCMP's fatal flaw wasn't just a single bad decision, it was the arrogance to believe they knew better than decades of accumulated expertise. When criticized, they doubled down instead of admitting error. When offered help, they refused it. When confronted with evidence of their mistakes, they defended their failures instead of learning from them. This institutional arrogance created a cascade of additional failures that destroyed any chance of a successful outcome. It transformed a potentially recoverable situation into an unsolvable tragedy. Here's what this teaches us. Institutions that can't admit mistakes can't learn from them. Organizations that prioritize self-protection over mission accomplishment will inevitably fail the people they serve. And when institutions fail, it's always the most vulnerable who pay the price. The community response to the Sullivan case demonstrates both the power of grassroots organizing and the tragic reality that such organizing shouldn't be necessary. Citizens shouldn't have to create parallel search efforts when children go missing. Families shouldn't have to fight for competent investigation when tragedy strikes. But when institutions fail, communities must step up. The residents of Lansdowne Station showed us what's possible when ordinary people refuse to accept extraordinary failure. They organized searches, demanded accountability, and kept the story alive when authorities wanted it forgotten. This teaches us that democracy isn't passive. It's not enough to vote and hope for the best. When institutions fail, citizens have both the right and the responsibility to demand better. Behind every institutional failure are real people whose lives are shattered by incompetence they didn't cause and couldn't prevent. Malaya Brooks Murray didn't choose to become a symbol of systemic failure. She just wanted her children back. Daniel Martel didn't ask to live under permanent suspicion. He just wanted to help find Jack and Lilly. The The Sullivan case reminds us that institutional failures aren't abstract policy problems. They're personal tragedies that destroy real families and communities. When we allow systems to fail without consequences, we're not just tolerating bureaucratic incompetence, we're accepting human suffering that could have been prevented. Years have passed since Jack and Lilly Sullivan disappeared, but the underlying problems that caused the investigation's failure persist. The RCMP has made some procedural changes, but critics argue they're insufficient. The institutional culture that prioritized process over people hasn't been fundamentally reformed. This means that somewhere tonight, another child might go missing. Another family might face the same institutional failures. Another community might watch helplessly as those meant to protect them fail catastrophically. Reform can't wait for the next tragedy. It must happen now, based on the lessons we've already learned at such devastating cost. The Sullivan case might seem like a distant tragedy that doesn't affect your daily life, but the principles it exposes are universal. Here's what each of us can do to prevent similar failures. Know your rights. Understand what you can reasonably expect from law enforcement during a crisis. Know what resources should be available and what procedures should be followed. Demand accountability. When institutions fail, don't accept excuses. Contact elected officials. Attend public meetings. Make your voice heard through whatever channels are available. Support affected families. When tragedies occur in your community, support the victims rather than participating in judgment or speculation. Offer practical help. Maintain compassion. Stay informed. Follow cases like the Sullivans. Understand how your local institutions handle crises. Ask questions before emergencies occur. Build community connections. Strong communities can respond effectively when institutions fail. Know your neighbors. Build networks of mutual support. Create resilience before you need it. Communities have power that individuals lack. Here's how communities can prevent Sullivan-type failures. Establish oversight. Create citizen oversight committees for law enforcement. Demand regular reporting on missing persons, procedures, and outcomes. Provide training. Offer community education on missing persons, prevention, and response. Ensure residents know what to expect and how to help during crises. Build partnerships. Develop formal partnerships between community organizations and law enforcement that can be activated during emergencies. Document everything. Maintain records of how institutions respond to crises. Create accountability through documentation and transparency. Support reform. Advocate for policy changes that prioritize human lives over institutional convenience. Support candidates who commit to meaningful reform. The changes needed go beyond individual actions and community organizing. Institutions themselves must reform. Cultural transformation. Law enforcement culture must prioritize service over self-protection. Mission accomplishment must take precedence over institutional image. Training enhancement. Regular, realistic training on missing persons cases must be mandatory. Case studies of failures like the Sullivan case must be integrated into ongoing education. Accountability mechanisms. Real consequences must exist for institutional failures. Officers and administrators who violate procedures in life or death situations must face meaningful accountability. Expert consultation requirements. Complex cases must trigger automatic consultation with specialists. Institutional pride cannot be allowed to override access to expertise. Family partnership protocols. Families must be treated as partners, not suspects, unless evidence clearly indicates otherwise. Their knowledge, motivation, and rights must be respected throughout investigations. 2 children disappeared into the night and were failed by every institution meant to protect them. Their story could end there. Another unsolved case. Another family destroyed by systemic incompetence. Another community scarred by preventable tragedy. But it doesn't have to end there. Jack and Lilly Sullivan can become symbols of the change that's needed. Their story can be the catalyst for reforms that prevent similar tragedies. Their memory can be honored by ensuring no other family faces the failures that destroyed their chance of coming home. This is how we give meaning to meaningless tragedy. By learning from it. By demanding better. By refusing to accept that these things happen when they could have been prevented. I'm going to ask you to do something specific right now. Share this video. Not because I want more views, but because this story needs to reach people who can make changes. Share it with local officials. Share it with law enforcement professionals. Share it with other parents who need to understand what they deserve from the institutions meant to protect their children. Join the conversation. Comment with your own experiences with institutional failures. Share stories of times when you needed help and didn't get it. Connect with others who understand that change requires collective action. Take action locally. Find out how your local law enforcement handles missing persons cases. Attend city council meetings. Join citizen oversight committees. Make your voice heard where it can make a difference. Support affected families. If you know families who have experienced similar failures, offer support. If you encounter tragedies in your own community, choose compassion over judgment. Stay informed. Subscribe to channels that cover these issues. Read about missing persons cases. Understand the patterns of institutional success and failure. The Sullivan case began with two children who should be teenagers today, living normal lives, making plans for their futures. Instead, they remain frozen in time at ages 4 and 6, their potential lost to failures that were entirely preventable. We can't bring Jack and Lily home, but we can honor their memory by ensuring their story leads to changes that protect other children, support other families, and hold institutions accountable for the lives they're trusted to protect. Hit that subscribe button if you believe Jack and Lilly Sullivan deserved better. Share this video if you think other families deserve better. Comment if you're ready to be part of the change that's needed. Because somewhere tonight, another child might need the system to work properly. Another family might need institutions to do their jobs competently. Another community might need the protection that Jack and Lilly Sullivan never received. We can't save every child. We can't prevent every tragedy. But we can learn from the failures that cost Jack and Lilly Sullivan their chance at life. And we can demand that those lessons lead to changes that might save the next children who need help. That's how we honor their memory. That's how we give meaning to their loss. And that's how we ensure that their story, heartbreaking as it is, becomes part of something larger, a movement toward the accountability, competence, and compassion that every family deserves when tragedy strikes. The choice is ours. What are we going to do with it?